All right, hey folks. So we're now in part 2 of the February Q&A, another round of really, really good questions. So let's get going. But firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. Let's talk. So first question is from 3 Days Grace. And the question is, my question is about RDLs. How deep should I go on them? How much of a stretch should I feel while doing them? Or we'll answer that first. It's sort of a two-part question. Okay, so good question, because the answer will vary from person to person. Now, the idea, I did a video on the differences between a Romanian deadlift and a stiff leg deadlift, and I'm of the opinion that they're different exercises for most part. A Romanian deadlift is one where you're working mostly on the hip hinge. So as a result, your knees should remain mostly semi-stiff leg, okay? And they shouldn't really change over the course of the movement, which means if you do the movement correctly, your knees will actually push back and your shins will go from vertical to slightly backwards if you do the movement correctly, because you're really pulling back with your hips and you're stretching your hamstrings and glutes. Now, in terms of where you end that movement, well, because your knees remain locked and your back remains arched, and it really should be just a pure hip hinge movement, where you end that movement is the limit of your flexibility. Okay, so you go until you are comfortably stretched and then you come back up again. That's that. The difference between that and a stiff leg deadlift is with a stiff leg deadlift, you are allowed to have a little bit more knee flexion and a bit more back flexion to facilitate a lower depth. And generally, the stiff leg deadlift is done from the floor to lockout. The Romanian deadlift is generally done from a position, from upright to a position where you're at your maximum stretch. Now, for most people that I've trained and my experience is, you're not going to touch the floor with that. If you're very, very mobile, and assuming you're doing it correctly, so you're only really stretching at the hips, then you're mostly going to not be able to hit the floor. Some people will. Some people who are very mobile will. So that's where you stop the RDL. You stop at the limits of your flexibility, with the proviso that your legs remain semi-stiff the whole time and your back remains arched. Okay. Now, he also said, I deadlift sumo with slight back rounding. Should my RDLs also be like that or conventional with flat back? So, I mean, I guess the question's been mostly answered. RDLs are a very strictly hip hinge variation. There should be no back rounding for the RDL at all. If there is, essentially you're doing a stiff leg deadlift, which is fine, but I think we need to recognize them as different exercises because they have different purposes. A stiff leg deadlift is a direct assistance exercise for the deadlift. It's one of the best. You can do it regularly or you can do it as a deficit. Deficits, while we're talking about it, deficits tend to be better for more advanced lifters who are natural pullers. Regular stiff leg deadlifts tend to be good for most people and for those who aren't very well suited, like long torso people. So yeah, that's stiff leg deadlift. And with a stiff leg deadlift, you get the depth. So you touch the bar on the floor, or if you're on a deficit, then below the floor, below where you're standing, with use of your hips, a little bit from your knees, and a little bit with your back as well. So you're allowed to just get the bar down. With the Romanian deadlift, it's a lot stricter. So yeah, if you're doing an RDL, the only movement comes from the hips. Everything else remains arched and strict. With a stiff leg deadlift, you can gain that movement from anywhere, which is what makes it more of a direct back builder for the deadlift, because you actually work the back as well as everything else. Now, sumo Romanian deadlifts give me a weird stretch in the inner part of my knee. Yeah. They will do. Yeah, like inner part of the knee and adductors, they're not the most comfortable movement for some people. You've got to work into them very, very carefully. I think for most people with sumo RDLs, I would probably just do sumo deadlifts. It's a tricky movement. The way that your legs are placed, because they're quite wide, it's harder to do a Romanian deadlift and it feel comfortable. I think for most people with wide stance work, unless they really like the Romanian deadlift done sumo style, I would just have them doing wide stance good mornings because they work great, or sumo deadlifts. Generally, sumo Romanians tend to be a bit awkward. And he also says, time blocking has done wonders for me. Good. So we discussed in a previous Q&A about time saving. He's a young man who's just in the middle of his exams. And I said to him that time blocking works really well. The general principle is that any task that you have will expand until the time that's allotted to it. So if you've got some revision to do because you've got an exam, you're probably going to take all week to do it unless you specifically time block. Here's where I'm going to dedicate an hour here, an hour there, an hour there. I do that with my work. I have to. So It's a very good way of getting the job done because you'll focus for that hour and then you can relax. I think a lot of people spend a large portion of their time just meandering on a lot of tasks rather than being direct on a few tasks. And it's better to be direct on a few tasks. You'll get more for your time. Also, once your tasks are done, you can also dedicate time to relaxing, which I think is very important because a lot of people feel like they never get time to relax, where the reality is they're just very inefficient workers. And people hate to hear that because they inherently want to believe they're really working hard, and you probably are, but it's very easy to get distracted, and distractions waste a lot of time. So an hour of focused work can be equivalent to 3 or 4 hours of unfocused, distracted work, and that ends up being very tiring because you still feel like you're working. It's a little bit like dieting. It's a lot like that. Not to get off on a tangent about this question, but it's a bit like dieting. I mean, if you diet in a very haphazard way, it could you could turn a 4-week cut into a 16-week cut. Seriously, people do that. I mean, you could turn it into a whole half-year adventure. And people do that. So focus your efforts and then reap the rewards of the rest which comes afterwards. Same with the diet. This is why I always focus on fast, hard cuts, because then you can go back to maintenance. Works well. Anyway, enough of that. Right. Ayan's one of the OGs of the channel, so thanks for the question. How to judge that I'm not going to get the next squat rep? When to stop the set when doing AMRAPs? Judging failure on squats is tricky. Okay. I don't feel that you should do an AMRAP on a squat. I think it's quite dangerous. I've not seen many people to go to failure on squats. I've seen probably 3 people in my life go to actual true failure on a high rep set of squats, like 8 to 12, or moderate rep. I've seen plenty of people fail on single attempts, or doubles, but on a reasonably moderate rep range, I've not seen many people go to actual failure. And those that do tend to work very hard. In terms of judging it, really, Ayan, the best thing to do is experience, because we all have different capabilities of grinding out reps. Like when I first started lifting, I could grind fairly well. And I was quite new to lifting. I could grind fairly well. I was quite explosive. I was naturally fairly adept at being quite strong early on. And I could grind really well. Some of my squats, when I first went from 3 plates a side to 4 plates a side, were real grinders. I remember one specifically, and I remember where it was. I was in Liverpool, England, at the training station on, I forget where it was. But anyway, it was sometime around 2004, something like that. But I was at this gym, and the squat was 152.5, and I was literally stuck for like 3 seconds in the mid position. It took that long to go through, so it was really tough. I think you're just gonna have to practice. Now, later on in my training career, I tend to got more explosive. I was a lot more explosive. I was training with much more single repetitions, much more high velocity type of work, and so I didn't really grind that long, and I would get stuck, slow down a teeny bit, and just fail. And it wasn't through lack of trying. It was just because I was so used to doing single repetition work. I was just very, very explosive. So I didn't really grind that much. I just died. So I'd say you've got to know yourself. Like, what kind of lifter are you? And then it's just experience. I could grind a lot more, at about the time when I was squatting about 3.5 plates a side than I could when I was squatting 4.5. So it varies. You have to know yourself. Okay, I'm not sure if that's a particularly great answer, but I think what is common is that you will slow down a little bit, but the true, real sort of grinding squats, that might just not be you, and that's okay. So it's worth bearing that in mind, because I know there's been some rumblings in the industry about whether people actually going to failure or not mentioning any names, and the role of the reps slowing down. It's very person dependent, and if you are a very highly explosive lifter, you just won't grind that much. I don't care if it's close to your 1 rep max, you won't. It just doesn't. That's what I've seen from lifts that I've seen, training that I've seen. So anyway, mostly it's experience. You'll get to grips with where you're at, what your capacity is to grind. Now, Lee says, hi Faz, with my training at the moment, I feel myself drifting more towards conditioning density work, such as circuits, giant sets, and short rest periods or main lifts. I find I'm enjoying this training more than traditional set training. The question is, do you recommend this style of training? And if so, how could I incorporate it? Lee, not only do I recommend it, but I do that myself. Like, I don't talk about my own training a great deal because I'm not sure how relevant it is for a lot of people. But for my own training, I do a lot of volume and I don't rest very long at all. I prefer training that way. So I will probably rest. I don't know. It's just one of those things where it's not always easy to talk about what you do yourself, because if it doesn't work for the vast majority of people, then it's not always that helpful. But since you're asking the question, yes, I do that. I do work like that, and I prefer it myself. Now, when I first started down the whole bodybuilding route, it was back in about 2007 because I'd hurt my hamstring. And I contacted a guy called Casey Butt. He's a Canadian doctor. And he basically taught me how to do full body training. He's the guy who's really behind the wizard, right? And he's kind of since retired. I've lost touch with him, but he's a great guy. I mean, really nice guy. He taught me all about that. I then sort of advanced what he taught me into what you see in the booklet in version 2. And I also did a lot in cutting down the rest periods. I found personally that I did a lot better with cutting down rest periods to as little as 30 seconds. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, that just seems a bit crazy. Like, you're not going to be able to work hard on a set. You've got to try and shift your focus away when you're doing that type of work. And you've got to basically look at an exercise as a series of sets rather than each individual set as its own big hitter. Like, if you're doing 3 sets of machine chest press, for example, with 3-minute rest in between sets, each set is its own like mini event. If you're doing 3 sets on a chest press where they're separated by 30 seconds, you have to view the totality of the sets. They almost count as one set in a way. I mean, not quite, but they do. What we do know is, over time, your ability to work hard on those sets will increase. We know that from studies. There was a study done a while back which compared the growth between a group of people who did 2-minute rest periods versus a group who did 30-second rest periods, and they'd worked down to 30 seconds, and it was equivalent growth. So your body can adapt. Now, the next question is, I guess, can you still progress that way? Yes, you can, as long as you keep the parameters tight. So if I'm resting 30 seconds, I'm timing. So I'm resting 30 seconds every week. So I am timing myself, okay? So as long as you're getting stronger under the same parameters, then you're getting stronger. And that works for whatever rest period you're using. Like, if you're using more traditional sets and you're resting 2 minutes between sets, great. Well, you can't say you progressed if 1 week you rest 5 minutes between sets. You didn't. Well, you don't know you did. In the same way with resting short rest periods, you have to be consistent. Now, the third and final point is, why would you want to do this? So I have a lot of weird and kooky ideas about why this type of training might work for some people. In my experience, and this is very unscientific, okay, I have actually wrote to Brad Schoenfeld about this, and he messaged me back and he said it was an interesting idea. But my theory is, I feel like if you are lighter boned, and I think it's down to your structure. I think if you're lighter boned, I don't feel there's a cap on your potential. Like, I think ultimately you can grow just as much muscle as somebody who's heavier boned, but I think your training has to be different. I feel that your training needs to be less dependent on outright loading on the muscles and on the body, because I think your joints won't be capable of taking full advantage of a hard set of 8 with 2 or 3 minutes rest. Now, you need to be able to work your muscles to the tilt to grow them the most. Strength is different, but somewhat connected. But for growth, you need to be able to work your muscles to the tilt. Now, if you're a light bone individual, your joints are always going to limit you at a certain point. When you get to a certain level of strength, just doing a straight set is not going to be enough to impose the level of demand on your muscles necessary to grow them consistently every week. And that point comes around sooner for people with smaller joint structures. I mean, it's just logical. You get this with bodybuilders too. Like, I know pro bodybuilders aren't the best example, but at a certain point in a pro bodybuilder's career, they will start to experiment with higher volume routines than what they built themselves up with. Like, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger's classic 6, you heard of that routine. It was just the basics done 3 times a week. Now, as he grew more and more advanced, he just couldn't bench, squat, deadlift, overhead press on a weekly basis for those low reps because he would just destroy himself. My point is, if you are lighter boned like I am, that point comes sooner. And for a lot of people who are lighter boned, that is the point where they'll think, oh crap, I'll just blame my genetics. I didn't do that. One of the reasons why I continued to get bigger and stronger was I employed a lot of these types of techniques. Back in 2007, I was doing full body routines with 30-second rest periods, and I was getting strong, very strong. And I'm doing that right now, and I'm really enjoying it. For me, it's a highly consistent way to get stronger week in, week out. It's just that I'm getting stronger in that particular rep range. There is carryover because I know, like, I'll give you guys an example. Currently, I'm doing, these numbers will be, I don't know how you'll be able to evaluate these numbers, if they're good or not, but I'm currently doing about 100 kilos on the bench for 3 sets of 8 with 30-second rest periods in between sets. Now, I don't know whether you consider that impressive or not, but it's a lot more impressive than doing 3 by 8 on 100 kilos with 2 or 3 minutes rest, like a lot more impressive. It's a lot more difficult. So take from that what you will, what my current bench max would be. So my point is just that I feel like there's a point where people's bone structure will limit them. If you are lighter bone structure, which I am, my wrists are about 6¼ inches. But I mean, look at me, it didn't affect my ultimate strength, is it? You know, it didn't mean I was unable to grow muscle. It didn't mean I was unable to get strong. I was still able to get strong, but my training to get bigger and stronger certainly had to be more nuanced. I had to think a lot more. I had to just work things out a lot more, which is one of the reasons why I make a decent coach, because I've had to do all that thinking, and I don't just know how to train myself, I know how to train others because I've done all the thinking which is involved in it. So Lee, to your point, anyway, I just know I'm going to get a lot of questions about that, but it's just how I train, guys. I find myself consistently making better progress that way. But anyway, Lee, maybe I should release an ebook about it. I don't know, for the light bone man. But as you've seen from my contest pictures, once you've grown some muscle with light bones, you look like a tank because you have this sort of really small joints and like hyper large sort of like muscle bellies. You saw that with my contest pictures. But anyway, Lee, to your point, you can progress like that. There's nothing wrong with progressing like that. Just ensure that you keep your variables the same. So your rest periods remain exactly the same week to week. You're still on the same routine week to week. I find I burn out a lot less. So I can continue the same routine for a lot longer, which means progress can occur for a lot longer. Also, which means I feel like I don't get as much joint stress, so I can consistently load and keep getting strong on the same thing over and over again for a longer time. So I personally feel it's better. I would rather take off 20 to 30 kilos on the bar and work just as hard by restricting rest periods than have to go right up to that poundage, 20, 30 kilos heavier, which might compromise my joints more. Just what I do. So hopefully that answered your question. It's definitely possible to do that with a lot shorter rest periods. The only thing I would say is I feel like you can not only get away with more volume, but it almost mandates more volume. Like you have to do more volume to cope with the increased workload. I feel like, probably 50 to even 100% more volume is required on that approach, which sounds like a lot, but in terms of gym time, you spend the same amount of time in the gym. So anyway, Ricardo's another OG of the channel. This time I won't miss my post. I started your HLM 2 months ago. It's my wizard routine. So far, everything is going well, but I still can't figure out the proper way to deload for me. Okay. All right. Now, I'll give you my perspective because I know, Ricardo, you're Natty, and it does make a difference with regards to deloading, whether you're Natty or you're enhanced, just based on my experience. This is not something I've particularly shared with people publicly, but I do train enhanced and natural clients, and I found the response different based on whether you're natural or enhanced. So for the natural guys out there, this is how I feel you should deload. I feel with the natural guys out there, I feel that you should deload heavily on the volume. Keep the intensity high. Keep the weight on the bar as high as you can. So let's say you've got a routine where you're doing, 12 sets per body part per week. On your deload week for the natural, I would aim to keep the poundages high, if you can, as close to 100% last week as possible. Or if you want to take off maybe 10 to 15%, that's acceptable. But drop the volume right down low. We know we can maintain strength and mass on a third of the volume it took to gain. So, and even less than that is fine in my experience if you're carrying fatigue. So going from, say, 12 sets, which let's say you're doing 4 exercises for 3 sets, which is very normal. Or no, if you're on Wizard, you might be doing 3 days. So let's say you're doing 3 exercises for 4 sets each, just for example, and you're doing 12 sets. For your deload week, just do 1 set of those 3 exercises. So you have 3 sets per body part per week. Just go to a top set and aim for that top set to be within 10% of your previous week's range. For a natural guy, that's the best way, because for naturals, muscle tension is the prime driver of growth. Okay, it's tension on the muscles, so it's the weight on the bar. Dropping weight on the bar is disastrous for natties. They don't need to do it. Drop the volume a little bit, keep the weight on the bar high. Now, for the enhanced guys, it's a different kettle of fish. I don't have many enhanced viewers. I know I have a few because they've mentioned it in the comments, but for you guys, you can drop the weight on the bar, keep the volume high, or even just take a few days off. A lot of enhanced coaches will tell you this. It's it's okay just to take like maybe 3 days off and just crack on with your next block of training. So different things. Roughly speaking, for in terms of deloads, for natural guys, you want to keep the weight on the bar high, drop the volume dramatically. For the enhanced guys, keep the volume high, drop the weight dramatically, or just take a few days off. That's generally what works in my experience coaching people. Okay. And he also goes on to mention that in some areas the deload was beneficial, like the hamstring. For others, it wasn't. He says he's not lifting that heavy, but he's wondering if he actually needs a deload. Ricardo, my opinion on deloads is I think you should have some type of deload fairly regularly, because there are certain areas in the body which don't give you feedback and they just go and get injured. So like a common thing is shoulder problems, elbow problems, back problems, stuff like that. In my experience, there should be some type of deload. Now, you don't have to take a week off, but like I've described, keeping the weight on the bar high, but just dropping the volume slightly is still going to allow you to keep progressing, but just reduce the fatigue a little bit. So I don't think you should ever go away from the gym completely unless you're on holiday or something. But yeah, I think it's wise to deload just to reduce stress on the tendons, because I'm a big believer that that can result in injuries. There are a number of coaches out there who still talk about deloads in like a sort of a very sort of airy-fairy, like just take it when you need it kind of sense. Like, I'm sorry, but like I coach people for a living. If you tell people to take a deload when they need it, they will take it precisely never. Yeah, so it doesn't work. If you've got a highly motivated guy in his 20s or 30s or whatever, and like he'll tell you when he wants to take a deload, it'll be on the first of never, right? So he'll train and train and train until he gets hurt, which is what happens. So no, preemptive. I will always be biased against taking preemptive deload, because you remember the story of me when I was younger. When I really exploded in strength was when I incorporated a deload every 3rd week. I know you guys are saying that sounds a lot of deloading, but that's what worked for me. I got bigger and stronger with that approach. That was how I finally cracked a 5-plate squat, 5.5-plate deadlift, and I finally cracked a 3-plate bench. You know, so I will always be on the side of preemptive deloads, because before that I was stalled on strength hard. I just, I looked like I didn't have great genetics. My bench was crap. As soon as I implemented a preemptive deload every 3 weeks, I exploded in strength. And that was the only thing that changed. So I will always be on the side of preemptive deloads. For me, they're not only for injury prevention, but for strength and performance and muscle gain. Because and we can't just say they're for powerlifting, because, well, if you increase your strength, your mass will follow suit. So we can't say on the one hand, okay, power building is great and we should all train for strength in the moderate rep ranges, but then say, well, no, deloads are only for strength. No. If you deload and you take advantage of that to catapult your strength forward and it works and you get stronger, well, clearly your muscle is going to grow as well. We're not going to have a situation where we just don't grow and all of a sudden we're benching 3 plates. It doesn't happen. So deload for performance and for health's sake, I'm a big believer in it. As I say, this is what I do for a living. I coach people. I can see this on a consistent basis. Bad things happen when you don't deload regularly. Okay. Thank you, Ricardo, for the question. Hopefully that answered it well. All right. We'll go with a couple more. Paul Velasquez, hey, Faz, always a pleasure to get your advice and encouragement. Thanks for all you do. Thank you. On nutrition, if I hit my protein goal for the day, does it matter what I feel the rest in as long as I stay at my calorie goal? No, it doesn't. Because the key thing is what you said at the end there, if I stay at my calorie goal. Now, protein, in addition to what you eat, can be good for satiety. Okay, so it can fill you up. Like I for the last few months, my protein intake's been about 200 to about 250, sometimes more than that. I feel good on it. I feel healthy. Like I tend to be quite full on a lot of protein, so it feels good. But if you're saying you are able to hit your calorie goal and you can hit your calorie goals successfully, then great, carry on. No problem. Fill it with other things. I don't think it matters. I personally feel that as a base of diet, everyone should eat for health. And I say that to my young and my old clients. But, you know, people are going to have breaks in their diet. Of course they are. It's the modern day. You want to have a meal with the wife on a Friday night, or you want to go out with the boys on Saturday night, whatever it is. Sure, we're all going to go off plan at some point. We're not robots, and neither should we be. Yeah. So this Friday night, I'm going to out for dinner. Going to have a glass of wine. Why not? It's fine. I'm not a monk. But my point is, I think I don't really want to do that on a daily basis, you know, because I'm more thinking about health. So to reiterate your question, Paul, no, have your protein, fill it with whatever else, as long as you can stay on your calorie goals. Now, if you are having trouble staying at your calories, then you can manipulate the proportion of macros in your diet. Like a quick tip for you guys listening is, in general, for appetite, as protein goes up and carbs go down, it tends to be easier to stick to your diet because it tends to reduce your hunger. Hunger, which then begets cravings, it tends to be easier just to navigate your hunger. Now, you do that too much, you'll start to get food cravings, but in general, that tilting the ratio towards protein and away from carbs tends to be better for most people in terms of appetite suppression. I find myself at about 100 grams of carbs, I've got enough energy to work out. And as you guys know from earlier in the video, I work out with a very high volume, but at the same time, my appetite is very, very manageable. So I use the appetite analogy of managing an employee. I'm going to make a video about this at some point, but I find that if I can manipulate my foods to give me good appetite control, then I don't have to worry about appetite. I prefer to manipulate my foods to control my appetite than I do to just eat to a certain calorie goal, because I don't want to be hungry all day. So it's kind of like managing an employee. If I manage an employee, I want to be able to just give them instructions and let them go off and away and let them do their work and just get on independently. That's the same way that I want with my appetite. So I set up my day with the levers of, you know, protein, carbs, fats, whatever, and food choices to enable my appetite just carry on in the background without it being a big issue. Now, I could fit into my macros. I could have a lot more carbs. I could have some junk food every day, but then I would be hungrier. So it would be like having an unruly employee. I would have to manage it all the time. So I use the good employee analogy. Treat your appetite like an employee. Set your day up so it's not a problem and it will just carry on working for you rather than constantly having to be addressed like poor hunger control. It's a good analogy. Okay, next up, I'll just finish with this question. Louis Bruno says, hi Faz, currently running your Barbarian program. What I find is I'm struggling with progression in pull-ups and chin-ups because I'm bulking and will be for at least 6 months. What do you think about switching to pull-downs, at least for a wave, and return to pull-ups and chins? Or do I need to quit whining? Well, no, you're not whining. It's a good question. I personally feel with that, you should accept that if your weight has gone up, you have improved. I mean, if you're half a pound up from 1 week to another, well, you've improved. And you match the volume, you match the weight. Well, you have improved. You've improved by half a pound. So great. And assuming you're looking at putting on about 2 pounds per month, which you should be, about half a pound per week is about right. So just bank on that when you're looking at progression. But yeah, it's a good question. He also says, what are your thoughts on mini cuts and when it's better to do it after bulks? My personal preference is to bulk or maintain for most of the year. Now, if you're regular guy, reasonable body fat level, you should be bulking for, I would say, 10 months of the year, and then maybe a couple of short mini cuts, about a month each. If you're overly fat, I would say you could probably reverse that ratio, maintain for maybe 6 months at a time, and then cut for the rest. But if you're overly fat, even if you're 30, 40, 50 pounds overweight, I wouldn't cut permanently, because then you run into the same problems as I was saying earlier. It just becomes one big mega permanent cut and you'll take your foot off the gas. Cut for short periods of time, even if you're very fat, and then maintain. one, it gives you experience of maintaining, but two, it breaks up the cuts so that when you are cutting, you can really put focused attention into it. And it gives you some breathing room to actually grow some muscle tissue. Ride the wave of motivation, but as soon as you start to feel that motivation slip, move to maintenance. If you're overly fat, hit maintenance for a while and then go back to a cut when you're ready. For most guys like myself, I'll bulk for about 10 months and I'll do 2 mini cuts per year. I did one in November. I'll do one in another couple of months, ready for the summer. Easy. All right, I'm going to call it there, guys. I will get to the next one tomorrow, but really good set of questions. The posts are still up, so keep them coming in, and I will put up another Q&A in a couple of weeks' time.